Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 6, 2015, the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Graves, is recognized for 60 minutes as the designee of the Majority Leader.
Mr. Speaker, 3 years ago, the Louisiana National Guard began a turnaround after coming in 38th in the nation in the end of September 2012 with a 98.4% strength. In 2013, the Louisiana National Guard moved up to 20th and last year ranked 15th. The Louisiana Army National Guard's fiscal year 2015 end strength goal of 9,554 soldiers was surpassed with a total of 9,650 soldiers, or 101.2%. The Air National Guard surpassed its 2015 end strength goal of 1,390 airmen with 1,496 airmen, or 107% of its goal. Strong numbers directly relate to our ability to respond to our state and nation. Great leadership under Major General Glenn Curtis putting a priority on personal readiness. Mr. Speaker, I'll tell you, I've worked very closely with General Curtis over the years, and he's an incredible man that has garnered incredible respect from the men and women of the Louisiana National Guard. Here are a few other statistics for your information. The National Guard end strength at 9,652 is 101%, or fourth in the nation. The Air National Guard end strength is 1,496, which is 108%, or fifth in the nation. The Army National Guard retention rate is 80%, which constitutes first in the nation. The Air National Guard retention rate is 82%, which puts them in the top 10. Medical readiness rate is 89%. The 256th IBCT ranked number 1 of 28 IBCTs, Army Community of Excellence Program, placed in the top 4 of 38 and received a site visit to determine top 3 spots. Mr. Speaker, I want to commend the men and women of the Louisiana National Guard for their perseverance, for their strength, and for their contribution to the state of Louisiana and the United States of America. Mr. Speaker, the United States military has began active engagement in Syria back in September of 2014, when the United States-led coalition began its ongoing airstrike campaign along with Bahrain, Jordan, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. During this period, the Pentagon also administered a $500 million, $500 million program to train and equip moderate Syrian opposition forces to target ISIS. This effort failed to train many soldiers or yield the desired results, and so the administration scrapped the effort. The wide range of state and non-state actors in Syria has created one of the most geopolitically complex conflicts in recent memory. This highlights the urgency and necessity for a clear strategy in Syria. What is the United States endgame? A definition of what success means in Syria. A strong commitment to eliminating any and all threats that ISIS poses to the United States, its allies, or a shift away from the conflict. I believe this administration has been incredibly vague about all of those, and I've repeatedly reached out to the White House on this topic and will continue to call on the President to articulate a clear path forward in Syria. Before the United States risk any American lives and resources, the Administration and State Department, the Department of Defense should provide clarity on U.S. objectives and how the ongoing use of military force fits into a comprehensive strategy for success in the region. Success needs to be defined, but I suggest defining success as the neutralization of all direct threats ISIS poses to America and our national security. We need to clarify the U.S. strategy in Syria now, and I hope to work with the administration and with other members of Congress toward getting us on the right path. Mr. Speaker, well before this Syrian refugee issue became a hot-button issue, I joined together with members on the other side of the aisle in bipartisan efforts to reach out to the Department of Defense, to reach out to the administration, to express these very concerns. And, Mr. Speaker, let's be clear. It's our failed policy in Syria that has created this predicament of refugees. If we had a clear strategy, a definitive strategy, if we had clear objectives, if we were aggressive in achieving those objectives, of eliminating, of neutralizing ISIS, of creating a new government structure there to fill the void created by us removing and helping to remove with the international community, the Assad regime, we wouldn't have refugees. We'd have stability in Syria. We'd have a place for people to live, and there would not be this refugee situation where tens of thousands of folks are being displaced into the United States and other areas, where we have this threat to our national security, the inability to vet these refugees before coming into the United States. And, Mr. Speaker, I want to be clear on this. Mr. Speaker, as reports have indicated in recent days, and I want to be clear, this isn't from any classified setting. This is a place where you apparently get real information, the Drudge Report. There are reports right now of folks with fake Syrian passports being questioned in Honduras and in Costa Rica. There are reports of Afghan and Iraqi refugees from years ago in Kentucky and other areas that have been involved in efforts to attack the United States. I'll say that again. Refugees from other countries, from Middle Eastern nations, from Iraq and elsewhere, that were previously brought to the United States and apparently not gone through a sufficient vetting process, were caught trying to attack the United States, according to reports that are out there now. There are reports of folks from the Middle East trying to illegally cross over and come into Arizona and Texas. Mr. Speaker, this is clearly a systemic failure. The inability to place refugees, to secure our border, to secure our nation. This isn't a partisan issue. We should not be sacrificing the security of Americans. There are ways to where we can be good community citizens, good world leaders, and allow for refugees to come here. Or, better yet, stabilize, help to work with the international community to stabilize their own countries. Mr. Speaker, I want to continue to work together with other members of Congress, including our Louisiana delegation, where just this week Senator Vitter introduced legislation to address the refugee problem, to ensure that we're not threatening our American security, that we're not sacrificing the safety and security for Americans in exchange for those from Syria. Together with Congressman Boustany, Congressman Abraham, Congressman Fleming, we introduced companion legislation in the House of Representatives to ensure that that happened. And I want to be clear again, Mr. Speaker, it's not some jumping to the hot issue of the day. Before this issue became a crisis and in the news, we joined together with Congressman Babin and others to ensure America's safety, to ensure that we were properly vetting these refugees before they came to the United States, to understand the the implications to taxpayers, the cost of having these folks here in the United States. So, Mr. Speaker, I want to say again, I'm very proud of the strong bipartisan vote that just occurred here in this body. But we need to continue to work together in a bipartisan fashion. This is not a partisan issue. Terrorism affects every American, and we need to continue to be very aggressive, not allow this to degrade into partisanship. This is about the safety and the security of the United States. Mr. Speaker, the Land and Water Conservation Fund was first authorized in 1965. There was some type of compromise that was reached at that time whereby this proliferation of offshore energy production would occur. And at the same time, there was a concern that those activities could threaten the environment. And so there was a negotiation reached whereby the first $900 million of this Land and Water Conservation Fund the first $900 million of offshore energy revenues from oil and gas production would be committed to the Land and Water Conservation Fund. The idea was that half of those dollars would be used to go toward the acquisition of federal lands for purposes of creating or growing national parks or wildlife refuges, BLM land, national forest. Half the funds would be authorized to go to state-side grant programs for similar types of activities to increase recreational opportunities, state wildlife refuges, state parks for citizens in the United States. That stateside program is a match at 50-50. The states have to put up half the money. Mr. Speaker, I would call the Land and Water Conservation Fund and its objectives a laudable goal to preserve these recreational and conservation activities for Americans. Certainly as this nation's population grows, we're going to continue to develop areas. So these areas that are especially sensitive, productive, and beautiful, let's ensure that we create those opportunities and retain those opportunities for recreation for Americans for generations to come. The Land and Water Conservation Fund expired for the first time in its history, and so this program is no longer an authorized program. And there have been folks on both sides of the aisle that have been working to help to reauthorize the program. I'll say it again, Mr. Speaker, I think it's a laudable goal. However, 50 years have passed, and I think in 50 years, with 50 years of history of this program, it's appropriate to go back and revisit the lessons learned. I'm from Louisiana, and I want to be clear. This offshore energy activity that's funding the billions of dollars over the last 50 years in Land and Water Conservation Fund activities and other things like the Historic Preservation Fund, it's from oil and gas and offshore energy activities occurring offshore our coast at home in Louisiana. Various bills have been introduced in recent weeks that propose, or discussion drafts have been proposed, to take these funds and cut them up and allocate them to different programs across the country, to slice up the pie. I think that's great for all these people to go out there and express their dream or vision for how all these things happen. However, I'd like to bring you back to reality. I view this as being our money, and I'll tell you why. Right now, when you produce energy on federal lands in the United States, 50% of the money generated from those activities go to the states that host the production. So let me be clear on this. The states of Wyoming and New Mexico together receive over $1 billion a year with no strings attached whatsoever. An additional 40% of the money from those same activities go into the Reclamation Fund to fund water projects in those same western states. So in effect, 90% of the funds from energy production on federal lands goes back to the states that largely host that energy production on federal lands. Yet when we go in the offshore, folks take the money and decide they're going to divvy it up to all these other states, but not the state where the energy is produced. Now, here's a reason why I'm so frustrated by all of these efforts to reauthorize and continue spending this money all over the country and other programs. Mr. Speaker, we have produced nearly $200 billion in revenues for the U.S. Treasury, $200 billion. And we've received not the 90% that other states have received, not the 50%. We've received less than a fraction of 1% back. The state of Louisiana passed a constitutional amendment that would dedicate any funds received to go toward actually restoring the environment, things like coastal restoration. The state of Louisiana has lost over 1,900 square miles of our coastal wetlands. Why is it that we're reauthorizing the Land and Water Conservation Fund and funding environmental and conservation efforts in other states, particularly in western states, which I will acknowledge again, it's a laudable goal, but why are we doing that before we're addressing environmental issues right there where these activities are occurring, and in many cases are occurring as a result of historic, several decades ago, activities that occurred in the coastal area related to this OCS production? It seems to me, Mr. Speaker, as we move forward on this, that needs to be a critical component. That needs to be the priority, is addressing environmental issues, addressing conservation right here where this money is derived from, because the activities simply aren't sustainable if we don't address this. I fully support the reauthorization of the Land and Water Conservation Fund. I think it needs to be done in a principled manner that recognizes the lessons learned over the last 50 years and most importantly, recognizes the fact that this area that has generated nearly $200 billion for the United States Treasury has severe environmental consequences or severe environmental problems right there as a result of the federal government's actions. Mr. Speaker, the Deepwater Horizon disaster was truly one of our nation's worst environmental disasters in our history. That disaster resulted in millions of barrels of oil covering nearly 600 miles of the state of Louisiana's coast. And the U.S. Department of the Interior, I think appropriately, took a look at well control and blowout preventer regulations and guidelines to ensure that a disaster like the Deepwater Horizon disaster and the awful tragedy to the 11 lives that occurred would never occur again. I think that's appropriate to take a look at that. The U.S. Department of the Interior actually took 4.5 years behind closed doors to develop a regulation, well control and blowout preventer regulation that was put forth in recent months. 4.5 years to write this regulation behind closed doors without involvement, without engagement of this industry, of this multi-billion-dollar industry. Now, the regulation was paired with a 30-day comment period. I'm going to say that again. They took 4.5 years to draft a regulation, and they gave 30 days for folks to actually comment on it. Of course, being very concerned about that and the implications, whether the rule was actually going to improve safety or be a detriment to safety, we asked that more time be given to comment to allow us to fully understand it, to allow the industry to fully understand it, to allow the environmental community to fully understand it. The administration came back and gave a 60-day comment period, which is absolutely absurd with the complexity. And keep in mind, Mr. Speaker, it took them 4.5 years to draft it. Now, to give you an idea of the disconnect here, the U.S. Department of the Interior says that compliance with the rule is going to cost $800 million. $800 million. A separate analysis that was done independently says that the cost of compliance is going to be in excess of $30 billion, Mr. Speaker. The disconnect there is crystal clear just in the cost estimate. It's going to have a detrimental effect on the United States national energy security. What this is going to result in, it's going to result in us becoming more dependent upon energy sources from around the world. Why are we not being energy self-sufficient and utilizing our resources here, promoting jobs here? There's a study that I read that says for every dollar in U.S. Produced energy, it has a $3 implication on our economy. For every dollar spent at the pump on foreign energy, it has a 40-cent implication on our nation's economy. I think the answer there is crystal clear. We should become energy self-sufficient. We should be utilizing our own resources. Mr. Speaker, analysis have determined that 20% of the oil and gas wells produced in the offshore over the last 5 years would not be producible under this rule. Not even producible. Let me give you an idea what that means. That causes an estimated $12 billion economic loss to the United States, to the U.S. Treasury. $12 billion just over the next 10 years. Now, you would think that the U.S. Department of the Interior would want to get this rule right. You'd think that they would be engaging folks. Yet we've had phone call after phone call from people saying they're refusing to engage. They're refusing to take meetings. They're refusing to discuss. And, Mr. Speaker, I've actually experienced it myself. Asking the U.S. Department of the Interior for a meeting with the Gulf Coast delegation, with House members and senators, to sit down and discuss this, to ensure that the Department of the Interior gets it right. And I want to be clear on what right means. To make things safer, not to propose regulations that are actually going to result in the potential for disaster, which I'm not an expert in offshore production, but I can read the regulations and determine the disconnect and the lack of technical understanding of the folks who drafted this rule. Yet the U.S. Department of Interior also told us that they would not meet with us. Shutting the door. Mr. Speaker, this is the United States of America. That's not how this country works. People at agencies have to understand they shouldn't be sitting in some ivory tower and drafting regulations that are going to export jobs, they're going to increase the trade deficit, they're going to make us reliant or dependent upon nations like Venezuela for energy, nations that don't share America's values. What in the world are we doing? Who's running this place? This is the United States of America. We've had people that have put their lives on the line to protect our freedoms, to protect our greatness. I don't think this is what they were protecting, or this is what they were fighting for. Mr. Speaker, I want to urge, as we move forward in legislation, the end of this year, that we take appropriate action to ensure that America's energy security is protected, to make sure that America's energy dependence is protected, to make sure that we don't take actions that penalize or increase our trade deficit, but that we promote American jobs, America's economy, America's workforce. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back.
I'm the leading state sponsor of terrorism